Well, today we have a client requested 40 inch by 40 inch floating art frame. After discussion, they decided they wanted it made out of maple with walnut spline accents in the minor corners. And so I began by securing the wood and working through the dimensions, trying to get the wood to the size it needs to be able to assemble it. But before we can go there, we have to consider the shape of the wood. In other words, if there's any cupping or bowing, anything like that. So it's helpful to alleviate losing too much of the wood by cutting the lengths down, if possible, where the cup or bow is limited as much as possible before dimensioning the wood down, flattening it to make our boards the size it needs to be able to start assembling it. So our next step is now beginning to flatten the sides of the wood, and this flattening we're doing here on the joiner, which by the way is an old joiner I got from my dad, and I was very happy to get it from him. He was a guitar builder. He built guitars named Benoit Guitars. But he has now passed away, but I'm very blessed to have this joiner from him. But as we flatten these sides, it takes quite a bit of. I'll go real slow because I've had the wood tear out, is the term it's used, where if the blade catches the grain just right, it'll pull out chunks of the wood, and in some cases if it takes out too much, it makes the wood almost useless. It gets so deep that you end up taking off so much wood that you're just burning away wood. So I try to go so slow and make sure I get it flat without risking tear out, because there might be some grain that goes multiple directions. So that's why I go very slow in this process, and it takes a lot of time, but this is the foundational flat side that everything else would be based off of, as far as the other sides being flattened and dimensioned. So I take my time and make sure this is done in the best way possible to prevent losing more wood again. So as you can see here, I'm continuing to ensure that these sides are going to be as flat as possible, because like I said, the other sides are going to be kind of based off of it. So also it's an opportunity to use the hand plane and get things really nice and smooth. The hand plane does a great job with that. And I also just love using hand tools, and the connection you get with the wood and how it feels and how it sounds is just a pleasure. So next I set up my jig I built to help me joint one edge of a board without the other side being flat. So the board that I flattened, the face that I flattened, is face down, and so I have to clamp it down onto this jig and run it through my table saw, and I get a perfectly flat and 90 degrees to the other flat face, so I get a good jointed edge there. So now I've moved to my bandsaw and got it set up for dimensioning the width of these boards to a little over a half of an inch. The half of an inch is what the boards are going to end up being, but I still have to run them through the planer to get this cut side that I'm cutting on the bandsaw here. It's going to be really rough, so I'm going to run it through the planer to get it flat and bring the dimension down perfectly to the half of an inch. I don't know if you can see the brown sawdust on the table. While I was running this board, I realized that this blade was very dull, and I struggled through this first board. So I had to assess afterwards to see, maybe it was just gummed up, I thought, and turned out the blade was very, very dull. So you can see the smoke there from it being hot. But I have a little system I built to sharpen my bandsaw blades. And let me tell you, if you haven't learned to sharpen your bandsaw blades, you're sorely missing out. It makes such a giant difference. And it also, if you get it set up straight and square to your blade, you eliminate much of bandsaw drift in the case where some teeth may be angled a little more than others and cutting a little bit more than the other side. So that's where bandsaw drift comes from. If any of you out there would like to see that setup and how the process works, I use a Dremel tool, and I built a jig to hold it straight and at the right angle and the right depth and all that. So let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a video on that. And it's a really long blade, so getting it set up to cut well is a big difference, as with all your tools. So now we move on to the planer, the thickness planer. This is where we have our flat face down, and that way when we run it through this planer, we get our top parallel to the front face, so the board is the same dimension all the way down the board. And it also gives us the opportunity to slowly work our way down to our dimension of a ½ inch. And in the end, we end up with a pretty nice face. It still needs some sanding, but it's pretty close to exactly where we need it to be. And of course, we'll have to run all of our boards through here to get them all exactly the same. You can't see it here, but I'm swapping boards and nibbling them down a little bit at a time, so that when we reach the final depth, they'll all be exactly the same thickness. And as you'll see, here and there I'll stop and use my calipers to ensure that I don't overshoot my ½ inch dimension, and I'll leave just enough to where I can sand down the sides of these boards to get rid of any kind of blade marks, making the boards perfectly smooth and the right dimension all the way around. And as you probably can tell, you may not be able to since these are sped up 10 times, but it takes a lot of time to dimension boards to the point where you need them to be before you can start actually cutting them with their, say, miters or joinery or that sort of thing. Just getting the boards dimensioned to the right dimension takes a lot of time. So a lot of people may not understand why custom built pieces are so expensive, but when it's just you and your tools, it takes time to get through these things. We have no sort of production process. It's just manhandling these boards one at a time. So now that we have both of the large surfaces flat and perpendicular to each other, we now can use those flat surfaces to join our edges to make them perfectly square to the faces. And that way, when we're putting together the frame, all of the dimensions will be exactly the same, perpendicular square, where everything will go together real nice and tight. One other thing that I've got to keep track of is the grain orientation. When you run it through this joiner, especially the edges, if you run the grain against the blade, it will tear out a lot of the grain and make just giant holes. And so you got to make sure and run the boards where the grain is oriented with the blades so that it's just shearing off the top and not digging in. So now that we've got an edge perfectly flat and perpendicular to the faces, I have those references I can bring over to my table saw. I can lay the flat face down on the table, the flat and perpendicular edge against the table saw fence, and I can now cut the opposite edge to the right thickness of 2.5 inches for the frame, and I'll have a perfectly perpendicular edge to the flat face on the opposite side. And of course we'll have to do that for all of the boards until we have we need 4 2.5 inch wide boards for the frame and some smaller boards to go on the inside that I'll show you later. That will be what the art will be able to screw to in order to hold it into the frame and make it appear like it's floating. And you may or may not have noticed that the edge of these boards have some burn marks from the blade on them, which tells me that that blade needs to be sharpened. I find when I have a sharp table saw blade, tend to get a lot less burn marks. So I need to get that blade sharpened, which I have another process to do myself. I don't have to send it off. They're fairly easy to sharpen. Also, those burn marks or blade marks, whatever you have on your board that you end up with, requires more time and effort to clean those up. So having a nice sharp blade will not only cut better, but it'll prevent a lot of extra work and time that goes on to have to clean them up later on down the line. So I've made the adjustments here to cut the smaller boards I was referring to earlier at 1.25 inches. So I need 4 of those as well. So I'll run them each through until I got the count that I need. Okay, I'm going to stop here and continue in the next segment just to prevent the videos from getting too long. If you care to continue to watch, the objective here is to show just how much work goes into these projects, these custom projects, and so that's why they're so lengthy. See you in the next one.